One of my favourite elements of Denis Villeneuve's Dune has to be the score by Hans Zimmer, which may not be his most approachable score outside of watching the film, but the way it supports the images on screen is one of the perfect fusions of visuals and sound I've seen in a long time. Zimmer wanted to create instruments and sounds that no one had ever heard before, allowing the viewer that is unfamiliar with Dune to feel the alien landscapes that they visit. His score works in cooperation with the footage to give the complete immersive experience that this film was aiming to achieve. In this video, I'm going to be analysing the incredible Dune score by Hans Zimmer, discussing why it contains such effective pieces of music. Before I get into it, if you want to keep up to date on any of my content surrounding Dune 2021, then don't forget to support this video by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. Also, feel free to check me out on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Instagram at Cortex Videos, which is all linked in the description below. But without further ado, let's dive into the score of Dune by the legendary Hans Zimmer. When composer Hans Zimmer was approached to score Dune, the movie adaptation of Frank Herbert's seminal science fiction novel, he knew the way he wanted to score it and the way he wanted to approach the film with a particular mindset. This was that it would not sound like Star Wars or other films in the science fiction genre. From a musical standpoint, those films built on influences from classic movie scores of the early 1900s. Even the tune from the cantina scene in Star Wars was inspired by Benny Goodman. In contrast, Dune involved Zimmer building sounds that nobody had ever heard of before. There was a freedom to get away from a Western orchestra, and he could spend lots of time making up these particular sounds. He had a deep inspiration after reading the novel as a teenager, wanting to bring this to the big screen one day, without even listening to prior scores used for the Dune property. And the resulting soundtrack might be one of Zimmer's most unorthodox and most provocative so far. Along with plenty of synthesizers, you can hear sounds of scraping metal, Indian bamboo flutes, Irish whistles, gigantic rumbles of distorted guitar sounds, a war horn that is actually a cello, probably performed by Tina Gio, and singing that defies Western musical notation. These are just a few of its disparate elements, and the score aims at combining this with the huge, chest-thumping sound of Zimmer's best-known work of the last decade. The radical use of sonic experimentation and weirdness is entirely befitting the saga of a futuristic, intergalactic civilization whose population are stalked by giant sandworms and revere a hallucinogenic substance, the spice melange. Sometime after his involvement with the band The Buggles, the German-born, California-based composer made his name with scores for Rain Man, The Lion King, and The Thin Red Line. But to many, he is perhaps best known for his work on Christopher Nolan's movies, including Interstellar, Inception, and the Dark Knight trilogy. In fact, Zimmer turned down an offer to work on Nolan's latest film, Tenet, to focus his energies on Dune, his lifelong dream. And that's probably the same for Dune Part 2, as Nolan is reteaming with Tenet composer Ludwig Göransson for Oppenheimer. Hans Zimmer said that he has been working on Dune and thinking about it ever since he first read the novel as a teenager, which is why he takes it very seriously. He avoided seeing the 1984 movie adaptation by David Lynch, featuring music by Toto, to preserve the vision of the movie in his head. As part of his creative process, the composer also spent a week in Utah, tuning into the sound of the desert. He wanted to hear the wind howl and get a deeper sense of atmosphere that would later be included in the score for the movie. Hans Zimmer's score is so prominent in Dune that at times the movie feels like an otherworldly implementation of the work he did on planet Earth, giving the soundtracks a big essence on nature. But it's also by far his most musical film. The score is almost present in the scenes or landscapes we see on screen, participating directly in the narrative of the film. It's spiritual, and to that point that the composer had so much music he wanted to bring that he ended up writing 3 different versions of the soundtrack. In addition to the original soundtrack, there's the Dune sketchbook, comprising extended sonic explorations, and the Art and Soul of Dune, a companion soundtrack to the book of the same title that goes behind the scenes of the film. I had the pleasure of listening to all 3, and hearing the sketchbook and Art and Soul soundtrack while reading the book are 2 experiences I want to continuously relive. The music is almost the perfect combination of poetry that lasts and physical beats that work well in the moment. And don't forget that Zimmer has still much more written for the recently announced Dune Part 2. But while it's the composer's name in the credits and on the multiple soundtracks released, he has once again preferred to think of himself as a member of an unusual band that includes a select group of composer collaborators. To Zimmer, if someone has a great idea, he's the first one to want to go on that adventure. The composer David Fleming, who gets an additional music credit for his contributions to the score, had explained that they create and collaborate on ideas, experimenting as long as the filmmakers will allow them to, before finally starting to apply those ideas to picture. He described their meetings as an open discussion, saying, "More than anyone else, you could count on Hans to push a bold idea one step further than you think it could possibly go, and then push some more." This collaboration is perhaps a comfortable environment for Zimmer, who previously delivered 2 great scores in Batman Begins and Blade Runner 2049, with the extended help of James Newton Howard and Benjamin Wallfisch. On Dune, he also worked with more new voices to develop the sounds we would later hear and admire. Guthrie Govan, a slide guitarist whom Hans had discovered on YouTube, described the process as one where he'd outline the desired end result, rather than prescribing a specific means of getting to that point. For one of the sounds, Zimmer apparently said, "This needs to sound like sand." And the process led to entirely new instruments being created from scratch. With pandemic-era travel restrictions in place, many of these elements were recorded separately in different parts of the world. A winds instrument was built from a 21-foot horn and a contrabass duduk, a supersized version of the ancient Armenian woodwind instrument. Chaz Smith, working in isolation, scraped and scratched various metallic instruments of his own invention, including one made from strings and saw blades, and another made from a superalloy used in cryogenic storage tanks and SpaceX engines. In the film, these are the sounds that support visuals of desert sands and wind-blown spice. The spice harvester scene is of course a primary example of these sounds on display. But it all started off with the track Paul's Dream, a suite that exhibits the mesmerizing energy of the desert power of Arrakis, a melange of strings, choir, strange buzzing, and the whirring of the ornithopter blades. The piece contains the DNA of everything that happens musically. There are 3 themes that serve as counterpoint, beginning gently but then circling back later. There was an amazing commitment from vocalist Lisa Gerrard, who was in Australia, coming up with a language that is all her own. It could be from the future, but it also could be from a different world. By contrast, the House of Atreides track, a noble piece about Paul's family, was highlighted by bagpipes. It was one of the major and more surprising musical moments that fully forms during a ceremonial arrival on the desert planet Arrakis. The scene is announced with the drone of bagpipes, generated by a team of 30 Highland pipers, playing in a converted church in Scotland. Ear protection had to be worn to record this, with the volume reaching the equivalent of an air raid siren. But perhaps the most mystical presence in the score is a choir of female voices, singing, whispering and chanting in an invented language that represents the Song of the Sisters track based on the Bene Gesserit. The true driving force of this novel is always the female characters, Zimmer said. It's really the women that craft the destiny of everybody. One arresting voice comes through like a war cry, all ancient, melismatic syllables in unsettled rhythms, and these vocals were recorded in a closet in Brooklyn. His singers sang for hours a day, emerging when it was dark, almost becoming a sacred musical laboratory. Stylistically, they drew on South Indian vocal percussion and Tuvan overtone singing. And when you start to hybridize these far-flung influences and techniques, interesting sounds start to happen. As one of Zimmer's vocalists stated, the experimentation is a vocal technique, and that technique is called Hans Zimmer. This perhaps best answers how Hans Zimmer created the score for Dune. He was always listening to his collaborators and allowing experimentation in between, even if the end goal is a vision for the music that he had. It's direct yet adaptable all at the same time, and the final outcome speaks for itself. Dune represents yet another Hans Zimmer masterpiece, a retro-future invention of music, conveying the beauty and danger of the planet Arrakis. And there's plenty of music left to come, and that which was left on the cutting room floor. For example, in Frank Herbert's novel, the character Gurney Halleck doesn't just lead the Atreides soldiers into battle, he also plays the balisette, a fictional musical instrument that is kind of a cross between a mandolin and a sitar. Though some scenes were filmed for Dune Part 1 with Gurney holding a balisette, we didn't get any of those in the final cut. And that's because the legendary composer Hans Zimmer recorded a lot more music for Dune than we ended up hearing. Maybe we'll see this scene, other scenes, and all the other music he did for the film one day, but what we do know after some interviews that the composer has been involved in is that he's already composed an hour and a half of music for the second film in the director's proposed trilogy. Based on Part 1, I can only imagine what Zimmer will do in Part 2, or the lengths that he will go to achieve the score of that film. However, the first film is an indication that it will be nothing short of masterful. But that was my video discussing Hans Zimmer's score for Dune. Denis Villeneuve insisted that Dune is the kind of multi-sensory experience that demands to be seen on a big screen in a cinema. In the same way, Zimmer's score is one that demands to be experienced via a good cinema sound system. The composer writes his music in surround sound, but it's not just about the big sound and the big screen. It's about sharing this big experience together. The sounds are almost physical in this film, and it relates to something that Zimmer has always done well. He makes you feel the movie through his music. Dune makes you feel the weight of the plot, it makes you feel the strangeness of the landscapes, and the power of factions like the Bene Gesserit using commanding female voices. Like I said before, this may not be the Zimmer soundtrack that you listen to on repeat without watching the film, but it definitely is one that works incredibly well with the images to go alongside it. I think it's his most important score since Interstellar, and based on what everyone is saying, I wouldn't be surprised if Zimmer picked up his second Oscar early next year. I haven't heard theatrical music like this in a long time that has moved me the way Zimmer did with Dune. But let me know down below in the comment section what you thought of Hans Zimmer's Dune score, alongside whether you agree with the points I have raised in this video. I will be doing more breakdowns on the film in the coming weeks, so keep a lookout for whenever I post. For much more breakdown videos on Denis Villeneuve's Dune, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like rating and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.